So thank you so much for staying till the end. It's been a very long day. But I think actually it's going to be an interesting session. I will spend maybe 20-25 minutes recapping some of the themes we've addressed so far. And that's going to guide our discussion, be a framework to really look at our 2018 goals and beyond. And at the end, I'd love to get some feedback. And Kaylee has graciously agreed to take notes to document the discussion. So I'm an ALD patient based in Palo Alto, California. I've been on the board of Ald Connect since inception. And I'm very happy, very impressed with this meeting, the turnout, the content, the energy, and just the wonderful individuals who are here today. So it's absolutely wonderful. Tomorrow morning I will share a more personal story in terms of my patient journey, what I've experienced, and where I'm at, health-wise. So next slide. So basically, in preparation for this talk, I looked at what some of our sister organizations are doing, some rare disease foundations, and try to outline what some of our 2018 goals could be. So I think we heard today a lot about patient education and education beyond the patient. And I think we are all in this together, which is to drum up awareness and support for this disease. And that means doing what I would call high-touch volume education for patients, patients who just got diagnosed, who don't have immediate access to very, very personalized healthcare, and as well drumming up awareness and support of this disease among physicians, pediatricians, neurologists who very often do not know this disease very well, nurses, and school districts, so that when they observe a certain pattern of behavior, they at least have an inkling that this could be caused by this disease. And so we do it with collateral, with content, with data sheets, with briefs that are on our website and also get distributed in the field as broadly as possible. We need to continue with our new website, which we're hoping to launch very soon, to have very fresh, very appealing content on this disease and its many aspects. So the genetics, the inheritance pattern, the pathology, how different the pathology is for different patients at different ages or with different phenotypes. Some of the symptoms and how they can be alleviated and managed. And so I think, for someone like me, being 51, having lived with this disease almost 10 years now, I'm really in kind of the disease management mode, is, living in the day-to-day, taking one step at a time, and managing my symptoms as they come up. And I'll talk more about that tomorrow. And then, one thing, one organization that I'm very familiar with is the European Leukodystrophy Association, ELA, based in France. You probably wonder why I know them. And their annual meeting is every year in Paris, typically at the end of March, last weekend in March or first weekend in April. It attracts anywhere between 300 to 450 people, and from all over Europe and beyond. And ELA is a big organization. They have roughly a $5 million annual budget, and they spent about 90% of it on family support. And that means, local meetups in small towns, little fundraisers for small businesses, a lot of grassroots activism, and of course a lot of toolkits to equip the membership with the ability to raise money, to raise awareness at the local level. And then they, of course, go in depth into house retrofits, assistive devices, essentially continued care, as well as reimbursement, financial planning, and so on. And then, one publication that I love, that I get in both print and electronically, and I recommend to patients, is Neurology Now, which is the publication from the American Academy of Neurology targeted at patients. And it hits, I think, a wonderful tone, which is it's never condescending or paternalistic to patients, but it's also not arcane and opaque. It's written in a very understandable, very engaging way, and I read it. I read it from cover to cover anytime I receive it, and I'm reading these articles about MS and ALS and Parkinson's and Batten and Duchenne, and I'm thinking, a lot of those learnings apply to me and to ALD as well. And then, one idea recently that I think a lot of us have brainstormed is also, I know in our community, and I'm on the social media sites, I think we have a lot of exciting candidate therapies being worked on, but the reality today is we don't have anything. We don't have anything that's been approved, that's been brought to market, that is at the bedside. And a lot of us are trying things. We're trying supplements, we're trying a bunch of different things. A lot of men in our community to deal with pain use cannabis. People use all kinds of things. They try them because short of very high toxicity, we want to try things and see if there is a small chance they could work. So I think it would be wonderful to have a sort of clearinghouse, as is the case in the ALS community with ALS Untangled, where there is an objective way to assess a lot of these alternative therapies and see if they have any kind of scientific basis, get clear evidence to see if they have worked, and if they have worked, as many of them do, try to understand why they worked, and if it can be reproduced, if it can be replicated. So these are definitely, I would say, outward-facing goals towards the whole community. Next slide, please. Okay, so at the end of the day, we are a catalyst, we're a vehicle, we're a platform for clinical trial readiness. So we are kind of the federator that a lot of these industry partners like Minorex, Neurovia, Vertex, Biogen, Bluebird, and others will come to and say, we want to look at the feasibility of a therapy for ALD. Tell us more about the community, tell us more about the data, tell us more about the motivation, tell us more about sites where we could actually deliver these studies. So that's who we are as Ald Connect. And so one thing is we want to continue qualifying and recruiting and qualifying sites, centers of excellence, and find the right synergy with GLIA to do that. Again, a lot of the country today is, doesn't have a good center of excellence within a 500-mile radius. That's wrong, and that needs to be corrected. We need to do fundraising for the disease. Should we think about a sort of next ice bucket challenge? And that was, of course, an extraordinary event. And interestingly, it was a miraculous event. I think that took the funding for ALS from a few $1 million annually to a spike of more than $100 million in 1 year. And of course, that has completely tapered off as the excitement of the social media campaign has died down. But the reality is that it has funded a ton of projects. My 23-year-old son is doing research on ALS, and when I asked him why, he said, "Pops, obviously it's because of the Ice Bucket Challenge. My lab got a grant. That would not have been the case without the challenge." We continue to be probably the best vehicle to apply for research funding from the likes of the Neurological Institute for the National Institute for Neurological Disorders and Stroke, NINDS, and other federal agencies. We have the ecosystem of industry, academia, patients to make a very strong appeal for federal funding. And then we need to continue strengthening and keeping our infrastructure up to date. And I think we heard today a lot about the need for a strong registry so that we know who the patients are, where they are, what is their condition, and of course, how have they evolved over time, and try to profile them for enrollment in clinical studies. And we need to continue to scout for therapies. So one of my pet causes is I know there are probably about 50 small biotechs right now working on a molecule that could be the molecule that cures ALD. And the reality is we need to proactively search for these biotech companies, because they may have heard of ALD, but they're not putting ALD today in the 6 or 8 or 10 indications they would like to try their molecule on first. And so, when we get in touch with them at medical conferences like JP Morgan or BioInvestor Forum, they always have the same question, which is, is there something against ALD today? Is the patient community organized? Are they hungry? How much risk are they willing to take? These companies want to understand more about the pathology of the disease, and they want to know whether there are specialists, people like Keith Van Haren, Ali Fatemi, and Florian Eichler, who can roll out a human study. So we need to continue to prospect for these companies and these compounds. Next slide, please. And then advocacy and bridge building. So advocacy, I think, is both at an organizational level as well as an individual level. And we heard, a lot today, the wonderful example of Gene Kelly and others, and of course, the group, the wonderful team that lobbied relentlessly for the inclusion of ALD in the newborn screening panel at the federal level, for the federal recommendation, and then for the states. And I think, I know my challenge is the disease is part of me. I don't want to become the disease. I don't want Ben to be just about ALD. So I want to remain a very, fun person to be with, but I want to never waste an opportunity to advocate for the disease. And that's on us at the personal level. And the thing I hear most often when I talk to fellow patients, they say, well, I'm not an MD and I'm not a billionaire, so I don't know what I can do. And I don't have any billionaire friends. But the reality is that we all have skills, we all have networks. And I think we have to find these opportunities to advocate. I think that's the big lesson of today. So a fun example happened to me a couple of weeks ago. One of the things I do on the side is I mentor 20-somethings on career transitions. And so I was mentoring this 28-year-old woman. And one day I got a call from her mom who said, you know, I understand you've been mentoring my daughter. You're making a big difference in her life, and I'm really grateful. How can I ever repay you? And at first I thought, you know, oh, don't worry, you know, I really enjoy working with her. But then I looked up this woman on LinkedIn, and I realized that she's the science correspondent for the San Jose Mercury News, which is basically like our Boston Globe. You know, it's our local paper. And then I called her back and I said, actually, how about we meet for coffee? And I met her, and that turned, you know, of all things, into a cover story about ALD and ALD Connect, and my relationship with Keith Van Haren. And of course, after that, an outpouring of support, of financial gifts. And so, you know, just a wonderful way to raise awareness and advocate for this community. And then, you know, we need to continue to partner with the likes of Elisa on of course, standard of care for families who have screen positive for ALD. And then finally, one very fun aspect, I think, of what we do is international bridge building, working with ILA, working with people who are all over the world, in Korea, in Argentina, and Moser talked about Bolivia. I mean, just going to these far-flung places and finding patients and you know, showing solidarity, but of course helping them as well. And then you know, very lastly, working with other groups. This is not, you know, a winner-take-all space. We can all benefit from each other. We can work together to raise awareness with legislators, with regulators, with companies, with funders. And so many of these neurodegenerative illnesses share you know, just a ton of common traits. And so we need to partner, you know, with, for example, FARA and the Batten disease community and many others to make more of an impact. And I think, let me see, there is another slide, but I think that's it. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. So I think that kind of encapsulated, you know, a lot of the themes we talked about today. I would love to have any reactions, any questions before we break for the social.
There's something you didn't hear about today that you would like to hear about. There's something you're missing, right? I always feel to get so focused on something. Might be missing topics that are important and relevant. I don't know if, can we hear from some of the women in the room? Anybody?
I have a scientific background. I'm an engineer, but I'm not an MD. Is there any books or sources that you would recommend where the semi-layman can learn about things like bone marrow transplants and some of this gene therapy that looks promising?
So a lot of this is newly evolving information that is probably best found in the websites that we are curating, whether it's that Stefan Kemp curates in Amsterdam or the Ald Connect website. In terms of staying up to date on what's happening, I mean, gene therapy is so new that there are no textbooks as such I hope we can come out with that one day as a gene therapy for dummies or something like that. But I think it's all very, very fresh, and so Ben mentioned some of the sources and how he educates himself, and he's been certainly a model for how to go out and find information and inform himself. I know, Ben, do you want to speak to that?
Well, I think these are very, very good issues. So one question, for example, that I got after the publication of the story is a lot of people came to me and said, you talk about having ALD in the story, and then there is mention of Bluebird Bio. Are you going to try the Bluebird Bio therapy? And and then you get in the weeds of is that therapy, will it work for adults? Is it targeted at the adult phenotype? And then what are some of the risk-benefit trade-offs? That I think totally add up, for a boy who is in the early but active stage of the disease and whose outlook is very bleak if the disease is allowed to continue its course, versus somebody who's more on a slow, very slow decline like me, who probably could be a little bit more reluctant to go with some of the risks associated with that protocol. And these are the kinds of nuances that are hard to find on any given website or in any any publication. You have to really kind of dig very deep to understand that.
Okay. Is there something out there on a NIH website that explains basically how DNA works? Now, I understand there's 23 chromosomes and the genes have like 20,000 base pairs on average, roughly, and we're interested in one that's on the 23rd chromosome, and it's out near the end. And I'd like to just understand more about the basics of genetics, I guess. Maybe if there is such a website out there, can you put a link to it on the Ald Connect website?
I know Khan Academy has some videos on DNA that are really good, very much for high school students.
Yeah, and NIH has some information, but it's quite rudimentary. In terms of clinical decision making, a lot of clinicians who might not know about ALD will go to a website called Up to Date, and those pages are also put out in layman terms as well, so you can get layman information from Up to Date. When it comes to the basic molecular biology, I'm sure there are a wealth of simple texts that would convey what DNA is, and I don't know how far you want to go, but Siddhartha Mukherjee's recent book on the gene is fantastic. I would encourage anybody who has some scientific interest to, and may not be in the field, to read the book The Gene. So very engaging and a wonderful story.
Okay, I think there was a question in the back.
I was just going to suggest the TED Talk, Nick Leslie's on
yes.
the gene therapy.
Yeah, that's a
And
wonderful,
beautiful visualization
Yes.
in that
Yeah.
too. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we had.
I'm curious. So this is our first year here. My husband has ALD, and I'm a caregiver, and I've heard you allude to information for caregivers. But I'm wondering if you've ever done or had discussions related to carriers. For example, his mother is a carrier, his sister's a carrier, but I feel like they get a little lost in the mix, a little lost in the shuffle of discussions, for mental health, emotional health. Symptoms they may be going through. Has that been a part of your discussions?
Yeah. So we have webinars on our ALD Connect website, and there are certainly women carrying the gene who are part of our different work groups. There's also information on Stefan Kemp's curated website, adrenalocatastrophe.info. Yes, a few pages. Mary, you want to say a little bit about
when I was diagnosed 15 years ago, there was no information. My internist sent me to a psychiatrist because I couldn't walk, and she thought I was faking it. My first neurologist said women get symptoms, but men get the disease. Get everybody tested at Hopkins. Well, we're just on the verge of getting a great deal of information. Ald Connect has hosted several conference calls for women with symptoms who share them. I highly recommend the AMC article on women, which lays out many of the symptoms women get. But talking to Ali, other patients, and other neurologists, I'm finding we have a broader spectrum. For example, osteoporosis is prevalent, and all of the side effects of that. Kaylee will sometime soon update the Ald Connect website with a lot of new information. And I'd be able to exchange. I've talked to several of you about symptoms and how we each deal.
And I will add one quick thing on the. So out of the article, a lot of mothers reached out to me who have sons who have passed away or are very sick with the disease. And then at the end of the conversation, I asked, well, how are you doing, health-wise? And they all had symptoms at some level or another. And they all said the same thing, which was very sad. They said, but my symptoms, I'm ignoring them because they're nothing compared to my sons. And so I think you have also a psychological dimension that women are, tend to frankly neglect their own health because they're so absorbed in taking care of their husbands, their sons.
I found exercise very valuable to get back some walking skills, and I'll start a more intensive exercise program now that my surgeries are done. But a lot of you are taking drugs for urinary incontinence. Pelvic floor exercises, if you find a good urogynecologist, it's something you can do for life. 5 minutes a day.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, just had a comment. My name's Bill. My wife's a carrier, and I have 2 boys. Well, 3 boys, 2 with ALD. I just wanted to say there's still a lot of the population that doesn't use social media. And so I find myself reposting, retweeting, re-whatevering the information that comes out from a lot of the organizations here. And I encourage some of my family members, get a Twitter account, if not just for that reason, or Facebook or whatever it is, because you can reach a lot more people. I retweet something, maybe 10 people see it. My wife does, 3,000 people see it. So there's some power in that, because you never know who might be watching or listening or seeing. So I just wanted to encourage people to use those tools. They're pretty powerful.
Brian, you want to speak to that, or?
I'll just echo those sentiments. I do a lot of the social media for Ald Connect, and just like Elisa does, and Jean, and other advocacy organizations, and it can be very, very powerful. Sometimes it's hit or miss. I don't know if you've experienced that, Bill, but sometimes you get an incredible amount of reach, and sometimes you don't. And so I think it's a function of sharing and people just reposting it. But it's a powerful tool.
Can you say that into the microphone?
Thank you, people, but I'm really not that popular.
You are now.
Last name is Grohl, G-R-O-E-L. I'm not Billy Joel, I'm Billy Grohl. You might remember that.
Very catchy, very catchy.
Yeah, it's working.
Other comments?
Okay, I just had to ask you about this stem cell tourism to Asia. I guess it's a bluff or something like that, but can you sort of comment a bit on that? You heard about it? Yeah, okay. No, I understand.
So I think that it's a bluff. Maybe that's the right way to say it. So I think there's a lot of money being made, unfortunately, out of people's hopes for many different diseases with these so-called stem cell clinics. There is many of them in Asia, typically in China or in India, and now in Latin America as well. There's a quite big one in Panama with US-trained doctors who are Columbia University-trained neurosurgeon, and so on and so on. So when you look in detail what they're doing, it's very hard to know what they're doing. There are some clinics that use mesenchymal stem cells that they claim they're using mesenchymal stem cells that came from cord blood, and others say that they use the patient's own stem cells. Others say that they use just stem cells. Some claim that they're using neural stem cells. There's no validation of anything they're doing. They're not under any regulatory agency in this country, and in most countries that have a regulatory agency, when these things pop up, they get closed down after a while. So we've been recommending people not to pursue those paths because they have no data, and they can guarantee you that it will cure, and they will also guarantee you that there's no side effect. And anybody who has had a patient here in the family who underwent bone marrow transplantation, you know that there's no such thing as not having a side effect when you get cells. And there is a couple papers out there, publications of human trials that were done in the trial setting. Both were coming from China, where it's coming from an academic institution. They used allogeneic, both are from our cord blood derived cells. Not in ALD, but in other pediatric neurologic conditions, where they just gave the cells as an infusion without the chemotherapy, without the immunoablation and all that. And when you look at those cases, they actually showed in both publications that the cells die off usually within 24 to 48 hours in the peripheral nervous system. Now, they may release some growth factors that may perhaps transiently be doing something, but certainly there's no data at all, and even I would go a step further and say there's no rationale, for instance, why these things would work for at least most of the phenotypes of ALD that currently are not treatable, like the AMN and females and advanced cerebral ALD. So yeah, it's a scam. It's the bottom line.
But this comes back maybe to Ben's point that maybe there would be a role within the ALD community for something like ALS Untangled, where there's a brief review of what is out there, and those of us who are in the field of stem cells know how trials are conducted and what regulatory oversight is needed, and what is lacking and not said in some of these other sites. So I think that's a good point to add to our list of things to do next year.
Sorry to bother you once again. I just want to know, Steve just made 18, which he was supposed to make 8 years old. What can I do? Like, what can I do for my son's whatever time he got left? Like, could you guys do a study on, to find out what's keeping him going? Because we don't know. And he hasn't had a CAT scan since the day he was diagnosed 11 years ago. And they told me he wasn't going to make 8 years old.
Yeah, so I think it's actually a very important topic, and I see Dr. Hoon walk out. So I'm very happy. Sorry, I didn't want to stop you, but
Oh, I'm sorry.
just big credit to having a trial in advanced cerebral ALD. Okay, I think that I want to applaud the fact that we're actually, some companies are starting to tackle that space. We have not done enough in terms of understanding outcome measures within the advanced cerebral ALD space, I'm going to argue. So I think a lot of what we know is the art of medicine and clinical practice and experience, but we do not have solid data to support notions of what improves function or survival, apart from sort of the medical management and G-tube placement, avoiding complications, things like that. So I think we need more.
I got a question. Give me 1 second. We've a lot of presentations have touched on this a little bit, and at least raised the question in my mind. I'm curious if yourself, Dr. Eichler, and the larger ALD research community, if we've made any progress in terms of developing even like a hunch of the diversity within the phenotypic expressions within ALD. It kills young boys, and there's Ben Lenail. So there's such a diversity in terms of how, and I remember that we had conversations about this last year, and I know that Josh Bonkowski and Bluebird Bio are putting together plans for some kind of study on that. I'm curious if there's been any kind of progress in terms of saying, here's maybe what's going on with why it affects some people this way and others in another way.
So the study you're mentioning is something that we're at Bluebird, we're sort of the epicenter of it. But what's underway is we're collaborating with academic partners, with Florian. We have material transfer agreements with other institutions, basically to collect as many DNA samples and as much clinical information that we can from boys who have the cerebral disease, and then men, and then some men with the adult cerebral form. So all of this is de-identified information, and it's all collected under IRB approved protocols. So, and then last week I presented in Philadelphia an early look at those data, and what we'd love to do is look at the genomes of everyone in the study, compare them to all of those different clinical presentations, and see if we can find some correlations. See if we can find some genes that may confer some, something that would tilt a child in one direction or another. And so right now we have only a small number of samples, but we have a lot of excitement around that around that study, and so that cohort is growing. And so, oh, definitely. So what we're looking for here, it may not be something that exists, but this is filling in the blank for a large-scale genetic study, which isn't currently published. So we don't know if we'll find something, but it's an effort underway to fill in that blank.
Maybe to follow up on that, is there one database, one set of where you collect the information about the symptoms that the person is showing, and you can match that against their specific genetics? I mean, I know the database you talked about, right? Is that the one?
No.
No.
We specifically, because it's, oh, sorry. The LD database is just collecting genetic information. It's completely de-identified. You can hack the site. What's underneath the site is what you see on the site. So it's and we specifically stayed away from phenotypic information because the genome, the genetic information within the ALD gene doesn't help you in predicting the outcome, but Neurobank is that platform that's completely secured, safe behind large walls, and so that's what that information will be.
Yeah, and yeah, so Neurobank is the platform that we use to where that clinical sites enter data. There's also a patient portal that you can sign up on and use surveys to tell us what is important to you in terms of resources, in terms of research. And there's a tool called Neuro Tracker. And why I mention this is it gives you the ability to track your own functional abilities over time. And every time you complete a survey at any given time point, you can print out a summary. And our goal is to, as enough people aggregate in this patient portal, that there will be an ability to see a de-identified aggregate where you will be able to maybe say, well, how am I doing compared to others in my age group, in my gender? So I think these are some of the aspirations that we know we have the technical tools for. It's a question of, can we also galvanize and get the momentum and motivation from the community to use them and make them richer and more valuable through using them.
So I actually have a question from somebody who is watching the live stream. So their question is how someone can push for a drug to be approved for compassionate access. It's difficult since there are no treatments available for people with advanced ALD symptoms, and they want to know how they could go about that.
Ali, should I? Okay. Okay, so compassionate use requires you to engage with a physician at an institution where the institutional review board will review this on a case-by-case basis, and certainly the important part is here weighing risk and benefit of any intervention and drug, and these are very difficult decisions. Because what a drug that might have shown promise in a healthier person might have adverse effects in somebody who has disease at more advanced stages. And so I think one of the challenges we face is when we are trying to learn from the experience from others, right? So we are constantly listening to our peers and finding out what works and doesn't work. And then the question is, how can I then apply that to myself or my child? And the challenge is that my child might be at a very different stage than what worked for somebody else. That having been said, I think if you do this with a trusted physician who can help you understand and monitor and weigh risk and benefit, and this can be put into, can be brought to the IRB, and importantly also brought to the FDA in terms of an IND application for compassionate use. This can be done. We've approached this with various other drugs in patients with advanced disease. It's not easy. That's all I'm going to say. I don't know if others want to comment.
Could I just add to that we've had personal experience with that process, and it worked marvelously well for us. We were able to gain access to a drug that was in clinical trial for our son when he was in his final days. What I'd add too is when you go to the FDA, the physician that you're working with also goes to the drug company, because somebody's going to have to provide the drug, right? And you can't just get it off the shelf. And the FDA approves virtually 100% of all those requests because they trust the clinician and you know, the process of the IRB. They always work together. So it's not the FDA that's slowing this process down. In the cases when a patient does not gain access, it is almost 100% of the time the company that says we will not provide the drug for various reasons. Either we think it would diminish the prospects for the clinical trial that's going on, because if everybody gained you know, expanded access, nobody would participate in the trial, or we don't have enough drug for everybody. We need to use the drug we've got to make sure this drug works. Let's make sure it works in this patient population. So there's a lot of misinformation out there about this attempt to use the right to try on a federal basis that some states have adopted. All that does is circumnavigate an attempt to circumnavigate the FDA, and doesn't make any difference. The FDA is not the obstacle here. So.
Good point, Ron. Other questions? So I think we've had a very full day, and we've reached 5 o'clock, and I again want to thank everybody for the engaging discussions and talks, and we'll have more of that tomorrow. So a round of applause to everyone. So.